This is the second lecture for our church music history class, and I want to take just a little bit of time to talk about what is called the sacred bridge, and that is the handing off of psalm singing from the Jewish temple and synagogue to Christian worship in early times. And I want to talk about it because there's some controversy over that over the last 20 years, especially, where scholars are debating this. Here's what's at stake. Most scholarship has believed, and it seems to me that this makes a lot of sense, that there was basically an uninterrupted stream of singing and psalm singing composition, so to speak, from the Jewish worship and their psalm singing through the Christian worship in the New Testament time period, and then from the New Testament time period on through the first 3 centuries of Christian worship. There are those that don't believe that, as you're going to read in chapter 1 of my book, and I just want to take a brief minute here to give you a storyline picture and tell you my view. I'm going to let you make up your own view, and when you write your paper, I want you to feel free to share what you think is most accurate. Basically, during the time of Christ, you have, of course, worship going on in the temple, and you have worship in the synagogues. And there in the temple, you would have a cantor who would lead those psalms, the psalm singing. He would sing. They were professional cantors. That's what they did. Then they would leave the temple, and they would go out to the various synagogues and lead worship out there. Well, when the early Christians were first converted from Judaism, they were still worshiping at the temple. They were still worshiping in the synagogues, as well as starting their home churches. And the singing of the psalms in the Jewish culture was pervasive in everything. They sang psalms in the temple. They sang psalms in the synagogue. So they're learning those. They were singing them in their homes. They were singing them in the workplace. They were singing them in the neighborhoods. We know this from historical accounts. So it would just stand to reason then that the early Jewish Christians would cultivate and foster this kind of psalm singing. I don't think there's any dispute about that fact. The dispute is over what happened in the first 2 centuries of Christian worship. Let me tell you the opposing side first, and you'll read about that in chapter 1 of my book. So Dr. Taruskin and Dr. Crocker, both from Berkeley University, renowned scholars, as well as a host of other scholars, believe that as the church was dispersed from Palestine, and then as the church began to branch out through the Eastern Church and the Western Church, that basically that handoff of psalmody was lost, and that the early Christians in the 3rd century or so, they did not have any direct link in their music and in their psalm singing to the early Christians of the apostolic age. They actually started composing their music from different influences, and I won't go into that right now. I don't agree with that, and I agree with the majority of scholars that believe this, and it's pretty exciting when you think about it. They can trace with reasonable assurance certain short melodic phrases in Gregorian chant and compare it to late Byzantine chant and other Near East forms, and see that much of Gregorian chant, especially in the psalm tunes, has, maybe you could put it this way, it has musical DNA, short musical phrases from that heritage. And it stands to reason, when you think about that would be true if these early Christians were singing these psalms, and then you had this flow of teaching, even though the church was being dispersed, a flow of teaching on how to sing the psalms, and that as they created more psalms and improvised in psalms, and these are passed down orally from generation to generation, they still had an imprint from the early Jewish psalms. That's quite something, because when you think about it then, the Gregorian chant that you can hear today, sung in English or in Latin, has been translated in other languages. You have a link to the very, very early church, and you have a link to our Jewish past. I want to take just a minute to talk about then why chanting the Psalms is such a superior way of singing the Psalms. Sometimes Christians today look back on Gregorian chant and whatnot, and they see it as a transcendent and ethereal and kind of an otherworldly sound, but they really see it as an archaic kind of thing, where you chant the Psalms, but it would be inferior to the way songs and psalms are sung today. But inherent in a chant is the fact that the words are served by the music, not vice versa. In fact, the rhythm of the music is supplied by the cadence of the language itself. That's another reason why I believe that this handoff would have been nearly impossible to extricate from the early Christians. I can't imagine that these early Christians would have been singing these wonderful psalms, knowing that it is the Word of God itself, and that they jettison it somehow, and then are marooned in history for a couple of centuries without ever singing psalms, and then start picking it up from the musical idioms from other countries. Am I saying that that is impossible? No, of course it's possible. But I'm saying that it's most probable that there was this sacred bridge. So, food for thought for this week's lesson and this week's paper.